Hi, I'm Jim Deitz from the Deitz Foundation, and I was asked to give a presentation today on games as they relate to civilians and the military, professional versus amateur, in terms of game design and how to go about production. So it's generally it's just a presentation. There aren't going to be huge amounts of graphics or cool stuff like that. If you have questions, by all means, feel free to ask. I'm a big believer in open information, and that the more people know, the better decisions they make, the better games they can make. Um, so with that, figure we'll get started. One of the first things when I was asked to talk about this, it came to me that a lot of people make an assumption that individuals in the military are automatically gamers and familiar with war games and simulations. And I think that's incorrect. I think the reverse is also an issue, that because somebody is civilian or living in the middle of Montana or Missouri or is in junior high, they can't know anything about the military or operations or strategy or tactics. And I think that's untrue. I think that's a perception that needs to be gotten around. Where I do think it's true is that with the military, that the soldiers, and I'll use soldiers, even though I'm sure they're Marines paying attention to this. I'm just going to say soldiers. The gaming experience they most likely have in 2022 is video games. That there are very few people I run into that are young people that have not played Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, all sorts of first-person shooters, in addition to team-based stuff, which could be even the sports stuff like NBA 2K or the Madden football games. The other bit of this where I think you do have professional soldiers with gaming experience is one you don't normally think of. When we're kids or you have family gatherings, at least before there were cell phones, families played a lot of card games, whether that's cribbage, spades, or euchre. So that the mechanisms of a card game, taking trump, collecting sets, moving up a scoreboard for like cribbage, these are ideas that are familiar to almost everybody. So that if we then add in, the other basic games, checkers and chess, everybody generally knows the concepts going on in there. So that whether you're a soldier, civilian, kids know this. So these become a way to relate things. With that, though, it became a question of ways to use games to educate. This is what the foundation that I run does. We try and make sure there's educational value in what we produce. And I think the key for this, whether, again, military or not, I'll just probably say gaming from now on, is something that Avalon Hill first created. I first remember from 1977 when they released a game called Squad Leader. And Squad Leader had this big 48-page rule book. It was a big box, lots of counters, and incredibly intimidating to look at. So what they did was create something called programmed learning. And what they did was they introduced certain rules, movement, how to fire, how to rally troops, and that was it. And now you knew enough to play scenario one. They gave you the units, everything else related to that. Great. When you had mastered scenario one, you moved on to scenario two, which added cool stuff like flamethrowers, buildings on fire, sewer movement. Scenario three brought in tanks and armored vehicles, and you progressed all the way up until you were capable of playing all aspects of the game. I thought that was a brilliant approach to getting involved in a complicated game. And I've seen a lot of other games that do it in similar fashion, where they have a core rule book that's introductory. A lot of European games will we'll call it a quick play or a quick setup rules that are basically 2 or 3 pages that you can be playing, and then as you need, you can look at the rules for other stuff. Those are usually very simple, but introductory level rules, intermediate, and then a third set in there that are advanced rules or optional rules. And I think this is useful for game design because you can make it useful for various levels of gamer, so that those introductory rules are easy for somebody with no gaming experience. But if somebody grew up playing board games and war games and is running around with a GMT shirt on or one from Armchair Dragoons, they can handle the more complex stuff. So I think that's important. I'll also give a shout out for a really great introductory game that a bunch of British guys have done called Take That Hill. Really simple, really fast, and it teaches the principles that they want with maybe 1 page of rules. I think it's great. And I think that becomes a gateway in. The other bit that you can use with programmed instruction is if your game mechanics, when you're designing it, potentially if you have a way to describe them within games they already know. In my other life, I'm a coach. I coach women's volleyball. I coach a lot of young people who have played other sports. They may have excelled in basketball. They may have excelled in softball. So that I will try and teach advanced concepts using terminology they may know from those other sports as well. So that in volleyball, a good passing posture is related to how you feel the ground ball. That basketball, going for a layup is like a slide attack in volleyball. Blocking is like a two-handed rebound. So that the girls have a way to relate it to information they already know. The people you would be aiming these games at may not know war games, but again, they know euchre, they know spades, they know checkers, they know chess. Examples of this would be, you have pieces and they kind of move like chess pieces, but that number on it says how many spaces they can go. So, okay, I can just count spaces. Great. Or the units have combat ratings, and bigger numbers are better, but you have air power like these A10s, and they count like the Bowers in euchre, or they're the trump suit. So that while that's not specifically accurate to the units and the air power necessarily in the game, it's a way to relate it to people that they will file away in their mind, depending on what you need that for. One other thing with programmed learning, and it's something I like, is scenarios versus one big game. And that kind of goes with the programmed learning. It is very hard to get people to sit down and focus on something that's going to last more than 4 hours. There are certain war games and big campaigns I love that you can leave set up for days on end, but diminishing returns in terms of attention span for most people. So that when you do game design, it's very useful to create scenarios that can be played rather than all or nothing. So with the Foundation, the game we have coming out at the end of summer, Free at Last, it is about the civil rights movement, and from 1960 through 1965. The game, the main part of the game, goes from 1960 through 1965, but you can break it down so that you can play any full year, 61, 62, 63, or 64. Those individual years within the game take 45 minutes to play. In an educational setting, that's a lot easier, and we set that so that would fit easily in a high school class period. For some organizations, you may have 3 or 4 hours available so that by short scenarios or 45 minutes or 90 minutes, it leaves time at the start for an explanation and afterwards for debriefing so that you get the discussion in that you need, not just the playing of the game. So I think that's important. Littoral Commander, Sebastian has designed the scenarios to be playable in 3 hours, usually 3 or 4 hours, with very minimal introduction. You do not need to know how to play games in order to play his game. And I think that's important too, to eliminate the intimidation factor when you see bunches of counters and dice and a big map board. I think that's important. So the other programmed approach is one where you find a theme and stick with that theme and change the game and its complexity level with it. So the example I tried to come up with for today was playing something incredibly simple, Risk. Once you know how to play Risk and get the idea of fighting back and forth, you move to Axis and Allies, which is a little like the European ones. It's more specific to an era. From there, you can move to something like GMT's Barbarossa to Berlin, where you now begin to have political events and don't have free will to move all of your units all of the time. And you can move then in complexity up to World in Flames, where you control the production, you have the economic ways to attack, factory withdrawal, etc. And if you really are sick, you could continue to something like Campaign for North Africa and the legendary pasta water. So, but you can find multiple games on subjects that you can add the complexity later on once the people involved are comfortable with the game. Hope that makes sense. Any questions here initially off of that to start with? Since I'm not seeing any. Cool, great, groovy. The next one is, and please remember, the person that got me involved sort of with games that relate to professional military education, Sebastian Bay, is amazing for the growth of the hobby and simulations and all this. And I love him dearly, but this is about Sebastian here. And the heading for my second bet here is die, acronyms die. Acronyms need to be avoided at all costs when you are creating a game that you are hoping can be applied to a general audience or people not within your organization. Acronyms serve to exclude a lot of people. They are something for in the know. And that by using acronyms, it becomes a way to make yourself feel informed and educated, whereas somebody else you are gaming with does not have that, which can be intimidating. It's like talking to somebody about cars and they start rattling off details about engine and torque and brake horsepower, and the person they're talking to is just like, can the car go fast? I just want fast. And they become intimidated out of the conversation. Acronyms are very bad for that. They get in the way of interaction. So I came up with an example from my coaching, which if I sit here and did this, you won't understand it. And that's NFHSA and IHSA aren't in sync as systems, having nothing to do with the LOI process. USAV only worries about impact and cap. LOI is the domain of NAIA, NCAA, and TYC only. You understood none of that. But if I remove those acronyms and really focus on, universal language, all of those acronyms disappear, and that paragraph becomes high school associations don't worry about the college scholarship process. Those rules are handled by the various college governing organizations, whether for 2-year schools or 4-year schools. Even though you do not know anything about coaching volleyball, that second paragraph just explained to you so you have a reasonable understanding of where responsibility is for giving out scholarships and accepting them and whose rules apply. Hopefully, that's understandable. The game I mentioned, Sebastian, is Littoral Commander. And when Sebastian sent me the original rules to begin editing and commercializing, wound up in the course of about 8 pages needing to remove more than 100 uses of acronym, and then did the same thing from the cards. I think this is important, not just for civilians or people living in the middle of Illinois that are just interested in playing games. This could be important between different services or experience in years within a service. Just as you can't assume military people are gamers, I don't think you can assume the Air Force will automatically understand the Navy's acronyms. And if you want your project, your game to be played beyond that scope, in the case of the United States, say with NATO or allies, I'm not sure you can presume that Hungarian officers, Polish officers, or German officers are automatically going to know the acronyms that you're putting in a product. And it is off-putting to play a game, and it sets the wrong tone if I have to set the rules down and go looking up acronyms or specific jargon for terms. And so trying to make it more universal in that way can be helpful for make it less intimidating, getting people into the game and focusing on what you really want, which are the ideas within the game, rather than fighting against a rule set. So if you can avoid the acronyms, great. If you cannot avoid acronyms, then you need to make sure to put them in like an index with an explanation at the front of your rules or the back of your rules. If you feel they're at the back, they're out of the way, that's great. But then you do need to make sure at the start to put a little paragraph. Hey, if you don't know an acronym, we've got an index at the back that lists what these acronyms are and why they're important, which will help the learning curve of non-gamers and people not familiar with the game being used. So that's the second point. And I got to claim I gave a bit of a presentation with the title Die Acronym Die. Any questions on that? And obviously I'll take questions and stuff when this is all done as well. Okay. The third bit of this that I think is important to consider with game design simulation use is civil military interaction. And when I sat down to create the outline for this about a month ago, one of the things that struck me was a comment made at a Marine Corps leadership seminar I attended in Quantico just before the pandemic hit. And I don't actually know if the numbers presented were true or accurate, but I would suspect they are. They said that at this point in the year 2019, that less than 1/5 of Americans actually know somebody who has served in the military or is serving in the military. And that if you go back 30 years, that number changes from 20% up to almost 50%, knowing somebody that served in the military recently. Probably helped by Vietnam being relatively close to 1990 in that regard or so. But it struck me that if that keeps spreading, that difference keeps spreading, it almost creates two different castes that do not associate with one another. It is not my intent to be political, but I think you can see a mirror of that or something similar between hardcore Republicans and hardcore Democrats, where they no longer make efforts to understand one another. And I think we run the risk of that with the military and civilian establishments in the United States. Games provide a way to help with that. A good simulation design, the example I'll use is Littoral Commander, but take that Hill works. I guess Assassin's Mace is on the complicated side, but could be used. Games show the general public what the military does in a way that can be understood. Most of the time, these may be history games, but when you look at it, you have the Harpoon computer game series that teaches naval warfare, modern warfare. Was it Attack Boat 688? A lot of the sub and Navy ones do this. Flight simulators at a small level show what's going on. I think that can be encouraged. I know the military does do some of that by sponsoring computer game competitions, e-gaming at the college level and such. I think that can carry over to board games. But I think, again, we get back to avoid jargon unnecessarily. Second, for promoting ways to include civilians in things or rebuild that relationship when it comes to gaming, use aspects of games that are known. I mentioned card games earlier. You also have gateway games that could help, such as Settlers of Catan, Ticket to Ride, or I'm sure even something like Codenames could be used to create a larger environment that's fun and also sneaks the education in. You don't need to beat people over the heads to get your point across. So that those various games, trick taking becomes about, you can equate that to taking territory, eliminating enemy troops, proper positioning on a battlefield, Settlers of Catan. You can poker, reading bluffs, probability, all of these things make a difference. Settlers of Catan, resource management and logistics. It doesn't matter that you are commanding a regiment or a platoon or a flight of planes. Some of this is about getting through to Tim Thomas in Peoria, Illinois, and to get him to understand that all of this is alike in ways he did not expect. This can not only inform him, but potentially help change his mind and attitudes towards what the military does. And I think that this can be really helpful with some of the games that are now being made. I think it's Playdeck puts out like Twilight Struggle, the understanding of what went into the Cold War and some of these other events. It's shilling for the foundation, but that's exactly what we've tried to do with 1979 revolution in Iran and what we're trying to do with Free at Last. We're not expecting you to know anything at all about the subject. We're going to give you some game mechanics, and then the game and the fun of playing the game is going to teach you what's going on. So the designers, the publisher, they're out of the picture, and you learn something about the subject matter and can explore it on your own. If you mention it, and then I'll mention Littoral Commander again, where it has value, in my opinion, is in a term that video gamers, people on Xbox and PlayStation know, which is a sandbox. Littoral Commander will have the units, it will have the rules, it'll have some scenarios, but then you can build with it what you want. You can explore what you want. And this is what goes on with those endless worlds from Skyrim and stuff. Just trying to keep the references modern here rather than referring back to Atari 2600 stuff. So, but when you're making designs, when you're using designs, you can increase the understanding if when you describe stuff, you can refer it back to common things that most people will know. Hopefully that's understood. Any questions there? Okay. So the last part of all this was I was asked what do I look for in a design and what do I think is good. But part of that in coming up with that, it became important for me to explain the foundation and how I got here and how that varies. So I got my start in gaming because of an ad in a cool picture in Boys Life magazine for an Avalon Hill game called War at Sea. Send $5, we'll send you a copy of the game. Awesome. I was hooked. A couple of my friends were hooked, and we grew up playing board games and especially war games. Adult life intervened, and an opportunity came for me and a couple of friends to purchase and start a chain of game stores, which was great initially. And then friends have falling outs, and then not so much. But in the meantime, I had created a set of Civil War miniatures rules that I thought worth publishing, and was told by distributors that you have to be a company. By game companies, if you don't have experience, we don't want to hear from you. That bothered me, so I created my own company. Distributors don't want to carry you if you are just one product, and if you have no experience of how the business model of production to wholesale to retailers goes. So I created Jolly Roger Games, and found out along the way that they don't want to carry you if you just have one game. You have to have more. So I started producing games, made contacts, and learned about production because that's not my educational background. Eventually coming in contact with like Jason Matthews and Christian Leonard, Jason from Twilight Struggle fame, Christian Leonard, and then Asger and Daniel, who did 13 Days, and grew from there. Along the way, Ultra Pro came along and said, here's a bunch of money. We want your company. I said, yes, sir, and went to work for them. When that ended, I simply coached for a bit, and then in 2019 realized that I was spending a lot of time complaining about the world, not doing much about it, and so created the foundation to try and do some good as a nonprofit organization. And if you're going to be a nonprofit, you have to have a mission in mind, and the foundation's was various ways of helping education. That means that if we ever make lots of money, we will endow scholarships for teachers. In the meantime, we will do little purchases for schools, interview clothes for underprivileged students who are looking to need interview clothes. We facilitated donations to grade schools and high schools for games, as well as books for the classroom. And so doing that, in addition to our games having educational value, 1979 about the Iranian Revolution, Free at Last about the Civil Rights Movement, 3 Years of War is about the 30 Years War being miserable, and stuff like that. So that's how the foundation started, and it's kind of where we're going with future products after Free at Last, which will include Littoral Commander, a game on the Palestinian Intifada from the 1990s, which is about social unrest. We're going to have one on the economics of scale, starting small and building into large corporations. And ideally, along the way, we'll pick up a couple of science ones. That's the foundation in the start of the company. So when I look, what do I think is good and what do I look for in a design are not always the same thing, because there are some good games out there that have absolutely no value to the foundation for various reasons. The example I'd use is exploding cats. As a theme, that's not something that we can really put into schools because of the name. You can't do that with something like company cheap ass games. You're not going to be able to have that in a 6th grade classroom. The teacher's going to get in trouble for that. And that becomes important as well. So I think in terms of what do I look for as a publisher, several things. It's about ease of explanation and setup. If you have to spend hours setting something up, that's not something we're likely to publish, because that's not going to fit in a classroom setting at any point. That's difficult to get officers around a table or NCOs around a table for 3 or 4 days, regardless of how good the game may be. I also like short rules. It's why Littoral Commander is amazing, that Sebastian, even with me harassing him about acronyms, was able to distill that into four to 6 pages of rules. 8 pages once you have examples in there. That's amazing. Next, I think it's important that the people playing don't sit around a great deal, because that's going to give them the temptation to let their mind wander or grab the phone, start checking. Oh, hey, look, it's, Cub game starts in an hour. Hey, sending text messages, and their focus leaves where you're at. So that I think there needs to be player interaction. Instead of I go, you go, it needs to be we go, so that there's constant interplay between the people involved in the game, the two sides, or multiplayer if you have multiple players. I like knowing ahead of time if the game is balanced. I think if the game is balanced and can remain competitive start to finish, you're going to have more success getting it out and getting played. I don't think games that are, I'll use World War II, that are about the first 2 months of the German invasion of Russia are going to be popular because somebody has to play the Russian and all you do is get crushed. There's no fun in that factor for whoever's playing the Russian in that instance. If the game is not balanced and one side is all powerful, I think it's not enough to just have separate victory conditions for the weaker side. I will still look at it if that flips over the course of a game, where the side that is strong at the start becomes the weakest later on, and vice versa. I think there's a great deal of challenge in that, in identifying the moments where things are equal and when to try and take advantage, when to prolong your advantage, risking a quicker or speedier downfall later on. I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand that, rather than just, I get to pound you, great, game is over. Can the game be completed in a single setting? For most games, I don't want to have to come back night after night after night to play. My schedule does not necessarily permit me to commit to every Tuesday from 5 till 9 p.m. Life doesn't work that way. So that makes it rough. Ideally, with a game, in most circumstances, we should be able to sit down like 1 o'clock on Saturday, play it, go, at the very worst, go get some dinner, come back, finish it Saturday evening. I think that's really the maximum length you're looking at for a game. I also, like I had mentioned, small rule books. I think those are fabulous. I also think if it needs to be longer, that won't rule anything out for me. At which point I'm going to look for the possibility of programmed instructions that I mentioned earlier, with adding rules in as you go, so that the players understand each section and build up a foundation. Or here are easy rules, and once you're comfortable with those, now we get some more complicated rules and rules on top of that. And that's what I look for with the foundation. Now, personal preference as a gamer, especially when it comes to military stuff, I like games that are not godlike. Basically 1970s and 80s war games primarily, where you control all units act as you want, when you want, and you can totally count the factors in all instances. You know how long a turn is going to go. Everything has been controlled for, other than maybe a die on the combat resolution. I prefer the taking away some of that planning ability. Maybe a turn's length is unknown and ends at a random point. It may be because of like a card-driven game, the number of cards in hand dictate your actions available and whether they're good or not. I want some aspect in there that forces me to be less than immortal in control of a side. Second, I think it's important that it feels like the real thing and offers the proper feel in some form. If we were to take Ukraine, Russia at the moment, the initial assumption was Russia was going to beat Ukraine 9 times out of 10. So we could simulate that by rolling a D10, and if it's a roll of 2 through 10, Russia wins. Okay, we've now achieved that, but does that feel like the situation at hand, what we actually want in our sandbox? And the answer is no. It feels like I'm rolling a die with an arbitrary win-loss total there. So I want it to have a feel of the real thing. And that does not mean that machine guns have to have rates of fire known or, anything like that. It could simply be, it's bad to walk across the open when the enemy has machine gun positions with clear line of fire. Okay, that's great. That's bad. Good. Don't let that happen. I think that is important. Does this feel real? If you're looking at a grand strategy game, you take into account the economics. Does it feel like the United States contribution is through its economic power? In the modern world, the feel like a real thing. I think there's a great challenge right now for design, given events of the past few years and how effective drones and unmanned aerial vehicles have proven to be. That how do you put those into a game in a fashion that feels real, yet permits the game to still be played in a reasonable amount of time? The next one is I prefer a sandbox sort of approach. I want to explore alternatives. And World War II games, I think you get that at a very abstract level from an old game called Hitler's War, where armies just had values to them and the map was very small, and it was about researching and constantly improving your unit types and everything else. You could fight that war if the Germans want to aim for atomic bombs and never build a tank, great. And it plays in a couple hours. A bigger, larger, more complicated game that does the same thing, World in Flames. You have a lot of different ways you can go about the situation starting in September of 1939. And I like exploring other possibilities. Or am I forced to follow history and do exactly what happened? I feel that way about Barbarossa to Berlin because it starts with the German invasion of Russia. There's no what would happen if we have peace. War in Europe from the 1970s is a brilliant monster game, simple to play, but everything has to proceed as it was, and there's no way around it. So it's fun to play, but you know you're going to have to follow the same path when you play it every time. I want I'll mention this. With modern games. When I was younger, I was happy to just fight the war in the East, or Fifth Fleet or Seventh Fleet and blast stuff. That's great. But I think games need to evolve to take into account a lot of the non-battlefield stuff. That may be World War II atrocities. That may be economics in some games. It may be if you're playing a Vietnam War game, the domestic situation at home with the United States. I think those things are important to have in there because they actually existed. And I think there's a gap, and people struggle with this, especially with World War II. Even now, if I put somebody in an SS uniform in a German tank on the cover of a game, I'm going to sell thousands of copies because, ooh, that looks cool. That picture does not show any of the atrocities or the barbarity that went on the Russian front. It doesn't show the forced labor in the German factories. And I think you have to have that sort of thing with games if we're going to advance the hobby in creating simulations. I know in Littoral Commander that becomes a big thing because it has a public relations track, and it's a bad thing if you get caught bombing urban areas and there happen to be YouTubers and people with phones there when civilians are accidentally killed. That will hurt your cause far worse than the loss of a ship. And then I had mentioned the I go, you go. I think for me personally, I want there to be interaction. I want a game to encourage interaction. And I think that holds true for professional military education as well, in that I think we ought to be able to pause in the middle of a game and be able, well, why did you do that? Why are you defending here? Why did you attack here? Because that can lead to interesting tangents that become educational in their own right. So I was playing a game in January, teaching my wife some geography. We were doing World War II because her history knowledge is lacking. And you get to the battle on the Russian front, and every spring you have mud. And so you go through it. In every game I've shown her, there's mud. And where that became useful is in our talks and discussing the fact that infantry is still useful, but tanks bog down and all that. About 6 or 7 weeks ago, she then raised the question, why are the Russians doing this in Ukraine during mud season when their tanks are going to bog down? Because, Jim, you said tanks are heavier today than they were. They're not going to go anywhere. So whether that point is true or not relevant, but you have somebody not familiar with the military and politics who is not a war gamer or into complicated games, who from her exposure from this now understands exactly where Ukraine is, the importance of Kiev, of the Crimean Peninsula, but also understands how weather affects supplies and military action. That becomes important. And that was possible in that game because of the way the turn flow, it was Columbia's East Front block game, how that game works with moving stuff. So I want interaction between the players, potentially the referee if you're doing something double blind, that it doesn't even have to be about the subject at hand. It can go off into various tangents, potentially even, Polish death metal music. And that works. So I think that's important as well. That is pretty much what I'm being paid millions of dollars to talk to you guys about today. Are there questions I can answer or comments, or if there are game examples you think that I should have mentioned, by all means, put them. Eventually, I'll look over on the Discord channel later. I'm happy to look and discuss that. On my name on the screen here, I put the Twitter handle for the foundation. You're welcome to reach out and follow me there. I do not make personal political comments there. That's really about history. It's about education. I save the Twitter politics for my personal account, where I haven't been able to be on now for 10 months. So our behind the scenes producer, Lissa, isn't showing me any questions or anything. So I think that would probably be everything for the day. If you have questions, by all means, I'm available whenever. If you don't do Twitter and you want to reach out through the foundation's website, that's just DeitzFoundation.org. Now we do have, and it's Dragoon Commander. When proving a rule set, what methods or examples can serve to assist the game design and future improvements? Okay. It's Vishwadra. God, I hate you. I hate editing. And anybody that's good at editing, you have just wild respect from my part. When proving a rule set, what methods? I think it's really good to have somebody not familiar with the subject at hand read it. My understanding of modern warfare is minimal at a technical level. So I did a lot of the editing on Sebastian's product because I understood gaming, but not the subject at hand. And I think that was useful. For Free at Last, it's been the same thing, that we had people not overly familiar with civil rights take a look at the rule book as gamers to see if they understood the concepts that we were using with the rule book. If you were around someplace with an event called Protospiel, I think those are great because they're gatherings of game designers, and you can ask them to play the game without your explanation, just from your rule book. So I think that helps with the rules, and kill the acronyms regardless. I will tell you this. I have a game I've designed, and I sent the rules to a great game designer, Jay Little, and I cringed when he sent me back his edits and comments, because on 16 pages of material, there was something like 200 comments. Oof. And I just felt like a complete loser. But I realized that's not actually the case. Those comments are there to help. And I'm really sorry for every student I had as a teacher in my use of a red pen, because I'm really trying to have a conversation about it, not correct it. So when you let somebody else look at it, just brace yourself, because their comments aren't meant to be bad. They're meant to help. And I think that becomes useful. The other tip that I'd give you there, Mr. Vish, is that when I was teaching English, I was told that it's very useful when you are writing something to read it out loud, to engage your ears on it, because when you read it for the sake of saying it, you are going to notice punctuation and grammar, and your eyes are not going to skip words. And it slows you down. And I have found that when I'm trying to correct language in something, it does help for me to say it out loud to myself and treat it as if I'm having a conversation with somebody rather than just reading it on a page. That's my long answer to that. Anything else here on this Friday afternoon? I'm hearing nothing from production. So that would be it. Like I said, by all means, you feel free to contact me through the foundation website or social media. We've also got a a Facebook page, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about any subject at any point if it's going to help further education in any way in terms of gaming. So, all right, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for listening. I hope it was valuable.